nirasya sarva sandeham nakikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasham Tattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashwat Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudakedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Yasri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madanamohano Adadanastrinam Dantair Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhuli Syam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Jirupa Chinta Malasapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa pada-kamalayor Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Marukari Yatu Pada-padme Bhaktir ya nikilarga varga jananiya brahma sakshat kriter anandatishaya prada vishayajat sukyat vimuktir yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhajayugam Yasyan Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namaha Yaram Ya Nikilarta Aghashanga Shamani Shodratitim Sangata Yasvadyai Rasikai Su Kabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we continue our discussion of Padyavali, and we're now in the Bhaktanam Niṣṭhā section, the section describing the Niṣṭhā, the fixity of Bhaktas. So in our last discussion we read the first two verses in this section, those of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. So now we'll venture further into these expressions of Niṣṭhā and come to probably the most well-known of all those that are found in this chapter, a verse that was said to have been pronounced by Sriman Mahaprabhu while he entreated Jagannath Dev at the beginning of the Rath Yatra, as the account of Mahaprabhu's observance of Rath Yatra is given in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So this is generally a well-known verse, so we'll look at its import today. So I'm starting from verse 74, and there is some discrepancy in different editions of Padyavali. Some editions of Padyavali put this verse as the first verse in the Niṣṭhā prakaran. Some put it 2 verses later. So I've followed the critical edition, but you may find other editions which have the order differently. So no great significance to this, but just in case anyone is reading off of another source, then this is why it's verse 74, not 72 in this case. All right, so we begin. Next, the compiler cites an expression that with humility conveys a bhakta's fixity in the limb of bhakti known as servitude, dasya, and the quality of non-conceitedness, amanitva, described by Srimad Mahaprabhu in his celebrated verse Trinadapi Sunichina, which was earlier cited here in Padyavali. So 2 prominent features of this verse are that it's an expression that's made with humility, it describes the quality of non-conceitedness, and in particular is classified as an instance of an act or the observance of the limb of bhakti known as dasya. So we'll go into more detail on each of those points in a minute. Nāhaṁ vipro na ca narapatir, nāpi vaiśyo na śūdro. Nāhaṁ varṇī na ca gṛhapatir, na vanastho yatir va. Kintu pradyannikila paramananda punamritabdher. Gopī-bhartuḥ pada-kamalayor, dāsa-dāsānudāsaḥ. I am neither a brahmana, nor a kṣatriya, nor a vaiśya, nor a śūdra. I am neither a brahmacārī, nor a gṛhastha, nor a vānaprastha, nor a sannyāsī. Rather, I am a lowly servant of a servant of a servant, of the lotus feet of the gopis' lord, the brimming ocean of nectar filled with complete, paramount bliss. As was discussed earlier in the commentary in regard to the quality of non-conceitedness, or amanitva, mentioned by Srimad Mahaprabhu in the 3rd verse of his Shikshastakam, the verse under discussion illustrates the character of a bhakta of Sri Bhagavan by illustrating how a bhakta does not identify with any worldly sense of self, as is commended in Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, one whose sense of I adheres neither to this body, nor to its birth, karma, varna, ashram, or jati, is dear to Hari. So here what is spoken of is this, quote, aham bhava, or a sense of I, or this experience of I. So this is the most fundamental feature of our conscious awareness. So how this is attuned is profoundly influential over all other cognition and thus all other emotions and actions that we engage in. So making an adjustment at this level has a domino effect of creating the potential for a complete difference in the nature of the action and emotion, decision, etc., that one experiences all throughout one's life. But it's not that one can shift the locus or what that sense of I is fixed upon just by simply, with the intellect, conceiving of a sense of identification at one moment. Because all the cognitions that we perform deepen samskaras that we have. So if we've fostered a particular sense of identity for a very prolonged period, then even if we wish to stop doing that, still the mind will continue to do that, and still desires, attachments, inclinations, thoughts, decisions, emotions, so many things will still upwell, if you will, based on that as a result of those samskaras. Nevertheless, to make the concerted effort to foster a sense of I, or to locate, if you will, the sense of I in a place that it is spiritually fortuitous to put it, this will bear great fruit if one can persevere in fostering in such practice. So as we've discussed in the past, whenever we go to perform archana, there is a phase in the process known as bhuta shuddhi, in which one purifies all the articles that are used that are going to be used in the worship. So among the articles used, in addition to the conch and the bell and so forth, there's also yourself. You, the worshipper, are also one instrument or one element that's part of the archan. So there's also a necessity to purify the self. So typically the term bhuta shuddhi, although it refers to purification of all the elements involved in the archan, it typically is used to refer to purification of the mind of the worshipper, or of the person performing the worship. So this is done through a meditation upon one's sense of self. In other words, when one comes to worship Bhagavan, one has to do so in the right mentality, and the fundamental basis of having the right mentality, or a pure state of mind, is having the sense of I attuned appropriately. So here in this verse, what's stated is the negation of unfavorable locating of the sense of I. In other words, to affix it upon the body, or to elements related to one's birth, one's actions, one's varna, one's ashram, one's jati. These things are not conducive to higher spiritual attainment. So one who refrains from doing that, they're described here as dear to Hari, meaning that one who can learn and practice so as to dissolve such identification and thereby identify with the nature of the jiva itself, the essential nature of the jiva, the swarup of the jiva, which we'll discuss shortly, and also one's aspired for sense or existence as self, that with which one aspires to render service to Bhagavan. This will be the foundation of all of one's sadhana, of all of the right-minded action, so to speak, that one does. So here, Mahaprabhu, in this verse, we see him do both. This verse in the Bhagavatam is speaking in a negative manner, saying one who doesn't identify in all these other things, they're dear to Hari. So in the verse under discussion, Mahaprabhu is saying, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, and he's stating a positive affirmation, this is what I am. This is the abhiman that I foster. So to attune, so to speak, there has to be both the letting go of the unfavorable and the fixity in what is favorable, or in what is ideal. So both of these are shown in the verse. And thus, when Mahaprabhu negates being a member of the varna and the ashram, we can take it that also applies to what is listed here. Meaning it's not just that he doesn't identify with the varnas and ashrams, but that he does identify with his jati, or he does identify with his birth. No, the idea is by negating these two categories in full, the implication is he's negating all manners in which one can remain identified with things of the world. So, with that in mind, moreover, the verse under discussion illustrates how a bhakta engages in the limb of bhakti known as servitude, or dasya, which the compiler defines in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu as, quote, servitorship unto him, namely Bhagavan, in all respects. Tasya kainkaryam api sarvata. Sri Jivapad comments in this regard as follows. Servitorship, kainkaryam, or dasyam, is fostering the sense of self, quote, I am a servant of Bhagavan, as is described in the Itihas Samuchaya, quote, one who after thousands of births shall have such attitude, that is, sense of self, quote, I am a servant of Vasudeva, can deliver all planes throughout the universe. So, sometimes you can encounter the understanding or the generic idea that dasim refers to engaging in service or performing acts of service. So that's also true, but what's typically lesser known is that in the Sindhu as well as in the Sandarbhas, Rupa Goswami Pad, Jiva Goswami Pad, they explain that dasya is not only rendering service, it's also fostering the attitude of being a servant. And that, as we'll see in the forthcoming commentary, it's when service is done with the mentality of being a servant that the practice is as it's meant to be, so to speak. In other words, if one performs some act of service, but one is still identified with the body, still pursuing something of the world, still motivated by some worldly desire, then this is not an ideal manner in which bhakti is performed or expressed. But when one has that purity and clarity of thought, that one's eternal relationship with Bhagavan as a servant of Bhagavan is the foremost, central, eternal, relishable feature of one's life, of one's existence for all lifetimes of past, present, and future, when one is, so to speak, present there in that eternal and spiritual sense, in that service, then that becomes rich, that becomes far more satisfying to Bhagavan, and an ideal manner in which acts with the body or with the speech or other faculties by which bhakti is expressed is enacted. So this point is expanded on by Jiva Goswami, where he discusses dasya in the Sandarbhas. So I'll read this as follows. Let alone the exertion of service to him, that is actually performing service to Bhagavan. Attainment or siddhi occurs even just through having the attitude of being such. That is, just by fostering the attitude of being a servant of Bhagavan. So this is a nice statement, not necessarily one that you want to use to justify sitting around and doing nothing, but nevertheless to understand the profound significance of the awareness that one fosters. That if truly one can simply even foster this attitude, this sense of self, that I am a servant, that itself is success, that itself is to achieve bhakti. And if you flip it around and say, okay, what if we do loads of activities in the world and we become expert at this type of service and that type of service, and we're busy all the time, but if our motivations for doing all of those things are also selfish and external, and we don't really have that attitude of doing it for Bhagavan, and doing it as someone who conceives of their very existence as being meant for that and only that, then how pleasing is all that activity? Not so much. In other words, the purity of bhav is far more significant and far more pleasing to Bhagavan than the volume or the level of worldly skill involved in a particular activity, which with those things, no doubt you can impress society. If you show a lot of anything, vairagya, knowledge, musical skill, acting skill, ritual skill, whatever, you can impress people and they'll write a narrative about you, and soon you'll be, up on some pedestal physically or mentally in front of them. But whether or not what you're doing is actually pleasing to Bhagavan is a completely different consideration. And Bhagavan is bhav grahi janardana. Bhagavan is relishing the bhav, not the physical offering. Thus, he says, if you offer me, Ganga jal and some tulsi with bhav, I'm satisfied with that. You offer me nectar on a golden plate without bhav, then I'm not interested. Similarly, build me, the world's, grandest X or Y, or make the world's biggest festival, make the world's biggest temple, make the world's biggest following, whatever. If the bhav is not pure in that, then how pleasing is that to Bhagavan? And the more you mix with the world, the more elements you involve, the more you try to do, how much more difficult does it get to retain the purity? Exponentially greater. The more quantity, the more rajas, the more obstacle. So you're almost guaranteed to ensure that, what you call bhav shuddhi is not sustained when you try to significantly scale things up. So rather, to aim for quality, to aim for something that is pure and relishable at a subtler level, this is far more progressive from a spiritual perspective. So these points we can derive from this statement of Jiva Goswami. Let alone the exertion of service to him, that is actually performing service to Bhagavan. Attainment occurs even just through having the attitude of being such. That is just by fostering the attitude of being a servant of Bhagavan. With this intention specifically, its, that is Dasya's description, is later on among the 9 primary limbs of bhakti. So Dasya is mentioned in this famous pair of verses from Prahlad Maharaj in the 7th canto, after the primary limbs of bhakti that involve specific forms of exertion, namely hearing, chanting, and so on. So Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, Vishnu, Smaran, Karan, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam. So everything listed before Dasya involves an activity, to hear, to praise, to remember, to do some attentive service, to bow down, to perform worship, what have you. Then comes this purely from this perspective that it's being explained now, as just this idea of fostering the attitude of service. This comes later. So Jiva Goswami is interpreting the significance of that, in other words, of the ordering of the elements, to say that that it's listed later to indicate that one can achieve success just by this alone. At the end of this aforementioned verse, that was just quoted, one who after 1,000 births, the following is stated, quote, what's more of persons whose pranas are given over to him and whose senses are controlled. That is, such bhaktas most certainly deliver all planes throughout the universe, since even those who are not such, but simply foster the attitude of being Bhagavan's servant, do so. So if one just has the attitude, but one's senses, one's pranas, etc. are not fully under control, still one can exist in a state of purity as well as purify others. So if on top of that one has reached a state of control of the senses and the pranas, then it goes without saying that their influence will be highly purifying of others. Just by a relationship with this servitude, that is, with this act of fostering the attitude of oneself being a servant of Bhagavan, even all other forms of worship becomes, oh dear, that should be become, all other, I see, depends whether you read it with the clause or not. Okay, I'll fix it later. Become greater, that is more pleasing to Bhagavan. So this is the point I was making earlier, that to do an activity maybe produce some pleasure, but when it's done with this attitude, then that enriches the pleasing quality of the activity. Furthermore, for those who engage fully in worship of Bhagavan with this attitude, I am a servant of Bhagavan, what remains unaccomplished in regard to the practice and the goal in any respect? Nothing. Meaning fostering the attitude of being a servant of Bhagavan and putting it into action accordingly is itself accomplishment of the practice and the goal. There is nothing else greater than that. That is, then the attitude of identifying oneself as a servant of Bhagavan, and accordingly engaging in Bhagavan's service for his satisfaction. So the implication there is that when one has that attitude and when one acts accordingly, then that itself is success, or that itself is perfection. The implication being that there's also bhav for Bhagavan, incorporated into that. In other words, it's not that one identifies as a servant, but then is merely acting out of fear, or is merely acting, out of a sense of obligation or something like this. This statement that he's making is, nuanced, if you will, within other principles. But anyway, I think it's clear. So, accordingly, Sri Rupapad cites the following verse from Naradiya Puran as an illustration of servitude. One who has the desire for servitude to Hari, that is the desire, I will be a servant, in deed, mind, and speech, even in all circumstances, is called a jivan mukta, that is, one who is liberated while living. So this verse, cited from the Naradiya Puran, is a little bit interesting because the very first word, iha yasya harer dasye karmana manasa gira, iha, has two meanings. One is desire and another is action. So you can find different translations and interpretations of the verse accordingly. Some may take it that one who has an action of service to Hari in thought, word, and deed, that person is a jivan mukta. So, although that's possible as a way to interpret it, here in this context, given that dasya is being discussed here as just even the idea, or just even the fostering of the attitude of being a servant, then the word iha can be understood to mean desire, because to have a desire for that implies that one has awareness of it in one's mind. So just to desire to serve him in thought, word, and deed, even if one doesn't fully do so, even that is equivalent to being in a state of jivan mukti. So this is stated to emphasize the significance of that core element within one's moment-to-moment awareness, or one's general attitude towards life, how one conceives of the self. When that is properly attuned, then we can say if that's attuned right, then the person is liberated, the person is already successful. Why? Because inevitably, as a domino effect from that, their actions, their behavior, everything is going to sooner or later come all in tune to that. And even just that itself is profoundly pleasing to Bhagavan. So, a little more on this point. Srimad Bhagavatam 2.10.6, in a well-known statement, defines mukti as fixity in one's essential nature, or swarup, having forsaken all contrary nature. So, muktir hitanyata rupam swarupena vyavastiti. Swarupena vyavastiti. So to be fixed, or to be in a state with, meaning in, one's swarup. This is called mukti. In a general sense, Jiva Goswami also gives a whole other different interpretation where he interprets the word swarup to refer to Bhagavan. That's given in the Priti Sandarbha, but that's not our subject matter here. So in this case, we're speaking of swarup with reference to the Jiva's swarup. So to have fixity in that, having left all that is not that, that is to be liberated. And as was discussed in the commentary on the 5th verse of the Shikshastakam earlier, Sriman Mahaprabhu has taught that the jiva's essential nature, or swarup, is that of being an eternal servant of Krishna, in accord with the statement in Padma Puran that the jiva is the knower of the field, ever dependent, and a servant of Hari alone and never of anyone else. A pure state of the fixity expressed in the verse under discussion, of affirming the jiva's essential nature, the jiva's being a servant of Sri Bhagavan, to be one's identity, abhiman and true self, can thus be regarded as a state of mukti itself, wherein one has relinquished identification with one's varna, ashram, and so forth, that is, all contrary natures, anyata rupam, fabricated by beginningless ignorance, anadi avidya, for jivas in samsara. So this verse, when Mahaprabhu is saying, I'm not a Brahmin, I'm not a kṣatriya, I'm not a sannyāsī, etc., this we can take to represent, I'm not anything but who I actually am, or I'm not identified with any of this anyata rup, this, quote, form or nature otherwise. I'm only I'm only fostering awareness and identity in my swarup, my essential nature, which is that of being a das of Sri Krishna. So this state of dasya that's described in this verse, this practice of dasya, this state of awareness, can also be equated with mukti, as per its definition given in the Bhagavatam. This conclusion can be further affirmed by reference to the Vedanta Sutra, where it is explained that moksha occurs for those who have fixity niṣṭhā in Parabrahman. The Parabrahman that is described in the Shastra is beyond the gunas of Prakriti, because of the specification of the moksha of one possessed of fixity in that. So if it says that one who's fixed in Parabrahman goes beyond the gunas, then is Parabrahman beyond the gunas? It has to be, otherwise the person who becomes fixed in it wouldn't end up beyond the gunas. So this is a subject matter discussed in the Vedanta, but we just mention it here to say that this implies that that fixity in that swarup also implies that that swarup of the jiva is nirguna, and that fixity in it is equivalent with moksha. So that then there's, however, one added detail. In other words, if one just had the idea that I am a servant of Krishna, this is how dasya has been defined so far, and this is how the jiva's swarup has been explained so far in all the passages we've quoted. But in the verse under discussion, it doesn't just say that I'm a servant of Krishna. It says, quote, I am a lowly servant of a servant of a servant of the lotus feet of the gopis' Lord. So he doesn't just say I'm a servant of Krishna, he says I'm a servant of a servant of a servant of Krishna. So what is the significance of this ranking, or of this repetition of being a servant of a servant? So this is interpreted by the commentator to mean, I am a very lowly servant of the servants of the lotus feet of Krishna. Maharaj Kulashekar makes a similar expression in his Mukundamala Stotram, which reads as follows: Mad janmana phalamidam madukhaita bhare, mad prartaniya madanugraha esha eva, tad britya britya paricharaka britya britya brityasya britya itimam smaralokanata. O enemy of Madhu and Kaitab, this is the goal of my birth, this alone is my object of prayer, and this is your grace upon me. Remember me as the servant of the servant of the servant of the servant of the attendant of the servant of your servant, O Lord of all beings. And in this case, as far as I can tell, the one break in the pattern by mention of the word paricharaka, or attendant, is for the sake of the meter of the verse. He's not trying to say anything other than servant there as well. So Mahaprabhu gave 3 orders of subordination. Here Maharaj Kulashekar is giving double that. The subordinate ranking of oneself as a servant of a servant of a servant and so forth, in these verses can be understood to convey humility, dainya. That is, a feeling of lowliness arising from longing to serve Sri Bhagavan in an ever more pleasing way. Read in this way, the fundamental intent, I think I need to cut that. The author is expressing, read in this way, the fundamental intent of the author, is expressing the affirmation, I am a servant of Krishna. And the orders of subordination included in the expression are stated for the sake of expressing humility, and not rather meant to be taken literally, since the essential nature of the jiva is to be a servant of Krishna, and there is no ontological hierarchy among jivas, given that they all fundamentally have the same essential nature of being manifestations of Bhagavan's intermediary potency, tatastha shakti, who are thus parts, angshas, and thus servants, dasas, of the whole to whom they belong, namely Bhagavan, as was discussed earlier in the commentary on verse 71. So this is how our commentator here on Padyavali reads it, is that the order of subordination of being the servant of the servant, this is figurative, and this is to convey a spirit of humility and longing. But it's not meant to be taken literally that one is or can only be a servant this many times removed, since the very swarup of the jiva is defined as being a servant of Krishna, not a servant of many in between. So that's one angle of vision on the verse, but we'll offer a second one as well. Srimad Mahaprabhu is said to have recited the verse under discussion while offering an entreaty before Sri Jagannath during the Ratha Yatra. And the verse under discussion in that case serves as a form of the type of entreaty known as that which is expressive of humility, Dainya Bodhika. If Srimad Mahaprabhu is considered to express this verse with the mentality of a samsari jiva, and the bhava of a bhakta, as he is said to have expressed the 5th verse of his Shikshastakam, as was explained in the commentary early on verse 71, then the expression, quote, I am a lowly servant of a servant of a servant of the lotus feet of the gopis, can also be considered to refer to the ultimate state of servitude a jiva can achieve on the path of bhakti taught by Srimad Mahaprabhu to his intimate followers Sri Rupa Goswami and Sri Sanatana Goswami, which he first inspired articulation of through Ramananda Rai, that is, the path of gopī-bhartuḥ upasana, whereby the jiva can attain the bhava, form, and service of a manjari, that is, a maidservant and friend, specifically categorized as a nitya sakhi or prana sakhi of Sri Radhika, who assists Sri Radhika's elder friends, more technically known as paramaprastha sakhis, in the service of the Lord of the Gopis, namely Sri Krishna. That is, the jiva can attain the identity and service of being a servant, namely a manjari, of the servants, the paramaprastha sakhis, of the servant, Sri Radhika, of the Lord of the Gopis, Sri Krishna. So in the Ramananda Sangvad, it's finally stated, when the discussion of sadhana comes, Atev gopī-bhav koryam gikar, ratri dine chinte radha, Krishna ravihar. Siddha deha chinti kore tahai sevan, Sakhi bhave pai radha, Krishna racharan. Therefore, accept the bhav of a gopi, and meditate on Radha and Krishna's play night and day. Meditating on the Siddha Deha, engage in service specifically there in Braja. With the bhava of a Sakhi, that is a manjari, one attains the feet of Radha and Krishna. So as per the Goswami's works, the Charitamrita, this we understand to be the specific confidential form of upasana that they presented in their works. And it, dare I say, so happens to refer to a 3-order layer, if you will, if you take it in this way. Some consider the manjaris are just personally servants of Radharani, not necessarily only a servant of a paramaprashta Sakhi and then Radharani. So I'm not saying this in a hard and fast way, but some are inclined to see a parallel between this relationship that is achieved in Brajadham in the state of Siddhi, as per the manner of upasana that Rup Sanatan and the other Goswamis personally practiced and taught, and in alignment with this verse of Mahaprabhu. Obviously, this verse spoken by Mahaprabhu, it's of unknown authorship. It was a pre-existent statement to the literature of the Goswamis, so it's not that was necessarily the intention of the original author, but nevertheless we can say that the two can be seen congruently, if you will, and can evoke some remembrance of what is held most dear and what is aspired for by those following this path. So this is one way of seeing it, which is not, you can say, ontological, but related to the nature of the aspired for attainment. So in that way, the earlier interpretation that it's primarily conveyant of humility and more of a figurative statement isn't in contradiction to reading it in this way at the same time. And one final point, which is also relevant in this case, is as follows. This interpretation of the verse under discussion also accords with the purport given in the commentary of Sri Jivapad on the aforecited statement from Srimad Bhagavatam, quote, one whose sense of I adheres neither to this body nor to its birth, karma, varna, ashram, or jati is dear to Hari. So we started out with this verse in the Bhagavatam, which is said to be one of the characteristics of an Uttam Bhagavat. So as the first half of the verse under discussion said, I'm not a Brahman, I'm not a kṣatriya, it negated any sense of I in varna and ashram, and by implication, the rest of these elements as well. So Jiva Goswami comments on this statement in the Bhagavatam by speaking about what's exactly described in the second half of our verse. In other words, part of it, to complete the sense of identity, so to speak, you have to both negate the non-identity and actively foster the healthy identity. So the Bhagavatam verse itself only states the matter in the negative, so Jiva Goswami comes in the commentary and states the positive that is meant to complement what is said in the primary Mool text of the Bhagavatam, and what is shown as complementary in our verse of discussion. So Jiva Goswami comments as follows on this verse. One whose sense of I does not adhere to this body along with these, that is, its birth, karma, varna, ashram, etc., as mentioned in the verse, but rather adheres only to the body to be attained, that is conducive to service to Sri Bhagavan. So he uses the same language here that he uses when he glosses the term siddha-deha or siddha-rupa rather, which is synonymous, but just to be precise, in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, when he's speaking about the practice of Raganuga sadhana bhakti, and the statement is made, Sevahi sadhaka rupena siddha rupena chatrahi, that service is to be performed with the sadhaka form and the siddha form here in Braja. Then he defines the siddha rupa there, which is to say the siddha deha, as this antaschintita deha, which is, here again, just as here he says, seva upayika, or which is a means of rendering service to Bhagavan, or which is conducive to, or part and parcel of, the service that is rendered to Bhagavan in the, or you could say, as per the nature of one's Ishta Devata, the dham in which he eternally dwells, and the manner, appearance, bhav, etc. of the parikaras whom he's accompanied by, in whose, what you call anugatya, or under whose auspices, and in following whom one aspires to eternally participate in his lila, relish his madhurya, serve him for his satisfaction, and so on and so forth. So Jiva Goswami alludes to this here by saying that both one who doesn't identify with the body, the varna, the ashram, and moreover adheres only to the body to be attained. So the body to be attained, that is, quote, conducive to service to Bhagavan. So the body to be attained is not, the next body you're going to be born into here in samsara. The, quote, sadhya body, or the body to be attained, is the body the spiritual body in which one can render personal service to him in the midst of his lila, in his personal company. So, thus, where is the, quote, I to be fixed? It's to be extracted from where it ought not be, and to be placed where it ought to be. And this point is also made by Jiva Goswami in the Bhakti Sandarbha regarding Bhuta Shuddhi, where he similarly also defines Bhuta Shuddhi there as conceiving of oneself as a companion or a parikar of one's Ishta Devata. So, therefore, if we apply this to our verse of discussion, when it says that I'm a servant of Krishna, then we can understand that to mean, the form of that servant that I am, so to speak, can be taken to refer to not the jiva's swarup as such, but rather to the aspired for form in which one longs to render service to Krishna in his lila. So, in essence, you can take this affirmation of fostering a sense of self, of being a servant, as per the swarup of the jiva, or as per the aspired for attainment that one as a jiva pursues on the path of bhakti. These are two different ways it can be applied, and we see precedent for both of them in the aforecited statements and discussion of our acharyas. So those are the points I have to share on that topic. So I think we have time for one more, and this one will be a bit shorter, so we shouldn't go over. So now, a nice expression from Mahaprabhu's Gurudev, Sri Ishwarapuri. Next, the compiler cites an expression of a bhakta's fixity, wherein a reply is given by an exalted bhakta to a remark from a follower of the path of Gyan, pursuing realization of non-differentiated or nirvishesh Brahman. So this verse and its context are all conceived as if a Gyani meets a Bhakta. And the Gyani makes a proposition to the Bhakta, and then this verse is spoken as the Bhakta's witty retort, if you will. So the Gyani, as if, says the following: "O sadhu, why do you sing songs about, quote, the primitive rasa in a social gathering amid the striking of musical instruments like mridangas and kartals?" So I've added some brackets here because the commentator is rendering it like this, but the language he uses is very nice. He writes it in such a way that you can see how when a Gyani makes this description, there's some pejorative intent in his description. So, by calling it, quote, the adi rasa, this is a way of putting madhura rasa down a little bit. In other words, madhura rasa is also known as ujjal rasa, or words that might evoke something more, nice, if you will. And to call it adi rasa or adya rasa is not in and of itself, it's not pejorative, but it can be used in that way. In other words, like the primitive or the original rasa, meaning like, the rasa that animals and jungle people are busy with. Like we're sophisticated, scholarly, meditators who contemplate fine, refined notions of philosophy. We're not busy with this adi rasa. This is like for the uneducated, this is for the animalistic. This is how you can sort of put a swing or a slant on these words. So it's as if the Gyani is saying, why do you sing songs about this primitive rasa? That is madhura rasa referred to slightly pejoratively, so as to suggest that the songs being sung merely incite kama in the mind, and thus counteract spiritual progress rather than support it. in a social gathering. Means sannyasis don't hang out in social gatherings where there's all kinds of the public there. Sannyasis keep to themselves. They live in seclusion, only amongst each other. You're talking about adi rasa, and more on top of that, you're doing it with anyone and everyone. And on top of that, amid the striking of musical instruments, means he's not, in other words, he doesn't write playing musical instruments. He says striking musical instruments. Means, this is annoying. You're disturbing our meditation with all this clanging. So anyway, there's some humor intended in the way the commentator wrote this. I thought it was quite nice. So I tried to ornament it a little bit. Anyway, so it's as if he says, you should engage in hearing the Upanishads, contemplating their meanings, and meditating upon Brahman like us instead. So, when this appeal is made, then Ishvara Puripad, either personally or representing a hypothetical bhakta, gives his reply as follows. Dhanyanam hridi bhasatam giri-vara-pratyagra-kuñjaukasāṁ satyānanda-rasaṁ vikāra-vibhava-vyāvṛttam antar-mahaḥ asmakam kila ballavī-rati-raso vṛndāṭavī-lālaso gopa mahendra-nīla-ruciraś chitte muhu kridatu. So he says, let the inner light, the elixir of the eternal bliss distinct from the magnificence of the transformations of Prakriti, shine in the hearts of the fortunate, whose abodes are the pristine arbors on the best of mountains. May some extraordinary cowherd of sapphire blue luster, the celebrated personification of the rasa of amor for the ballavis, delighting in the forest of Vrinda, play constantly in our hearts. So this is a very nice one, all through very nicely chosen words and images and language. So let's go through what he means here. The core expression in this verse, quote, let the inner light shine, means let non-differentiated Brahman be realized. So in other words, he's saying to the Jnani, you want to realize Brahman, or you and others are following the path of Brahman, let it be. May you have that realization. May that light shine. This is further described as the elixir of eternal bliss, to indicate that realization of non-differentiated Brahman gives rise to a form of eternal satisfaction. So he's not putting it down. He's saying this inner light, this eternal bliss is like an elixir. This is what you cherish. This is what you aspire for. This nirvishesh Brahman. Go ahead. The inner light of non-differentiated Brahman being further described as distinct from the magnificence of the transformations indicates that non-differentiated Brahman is categorically distinct from the transformations of Prakriti. That is, ego, the objects of the senses, the gross elements, and so forth, which can be considered the magnificence thereof. Alternately, vikāra-vibhava-vyāvṛttam can be understood to mean that because of which the negation of Prakriti, that the magnificence of which end in transformation, that is, that from which everything that manifests is inevitably dissolved eventually. So you can take it in two different ways. In any case, he's just saying that this elixir that you want to drink, this light that you want to have to shine, is this eternal bliss that you want. It's beyond Prakriti. It's beyond all the things that will eventually dissolve and will eventually cause suffering. It will give you eternal peace. It will give you eternal satisfaction. Let it shine. Let it be. May you drink that elixir. And moreover, he describes this as, where do these jnanis do their sadhana? The pristine arbors on the best of mountains, refers to the idyllic forests on the slopes of Sri Shaila, Arunachal Parvat, and other mountains that are ideal places for meditation upon non-differentiated Brahman. We hear that Pulasti Rishi in the Garga Samhita, he wanted to bring Govardhan down to the earth so that he could do tapasya. He wanted some excellent, serene mountain in order to do his tapasya. So to do that type of sadhana, you need a very tranquil environment. So certain places in the south are well known for this. Shaila, Arunachal Parvat, even in the modern day, or relatively the modern, previous century, there was a very famous, highly respected Jnani Mahatma named Ramana Maharshi, who lived at Arunachal Parvat. Still today, there are many persons who follow his teachings and so forth. So persons live in such places, they engage in, the path of Gyan, and they have realization of Brahman. He's not saying anything negative about it. He's not putting it down. He's not saying it's unreal. He's not saying you shouldn't do it. He's saying, let it be. Let it shine. Let that light shine. In the verse itself, there isn't even a but or a however or a catch. It's just the first half of the verse, it just says this. It just says, let the light shine. And then, without any particular conjunction or anything, and then he just says, and he makes another invocation or another prayer in the second half, which is to say, but this is my view, and this is how I feel. So the author, Ishara Puripad, states the first half of the verse in response to the follower of the path of Gyan, who suggested that he change his ways, so as to indicate that he has no objection to the path being followed by the Jnani, that he regards Jnanis who follow the path as fortunate, and that he wishes those Jnanis well in attaining their desired goal of realization of non-differentiated Brahman. So the path to that realization, that path of Gyan, it's also taught by the Bhagavatam. It's also taught by the Upanishads. It's also taught by Krishna himself. So Krishna Bhaktas are not going to say that this is unreal or that this doesn't exist or that it doesn't have its place for those who aspire to it. They say, let it be. That said, he then conveys that he has no inclination towards that path or that goal, because his desired object is only absorption in bhakti to Swayam Bhagavan Sri Krishna in the midst of Sri Krishna's Leela with the gopis in the spiritual realm of Sri Brajadham. Thus, he expresses the cherished prayer of his heart and thereby expresses his fixity in the second half of the verse with a touch of enticement and humor. In other words, he doesn't say anything against, he says, let it be so. But then he gives a rich description of his prayer, of his personal interest. So there's just a subtle, play or a subtle appeal, if you will, but in a respectful, in a non-confrontational way. Saying in essence, may some extraordinary cowherd of sapphire blue luster play constantly in our hearts. So he also, is coming back to this notion of light. In other words, Jnanis oftentimes speak or conceive of Brahman to be like light. So he's saying, let the inner light of Brahman shine to you, may you perceive that. And we also wish to perceive some highly relishable light, but that light will be blue, or there'll be a sapphire blue luster of our extraordinary Krishna. That's the light that we want to shine in our heart, rather than the light of Nirvishesh Brahman. We prefer the rich blue luster of Krishna's figure to the, quote, inner light of non-differentiated Brahman. The rasa of amor for the ballavis indicates that Sri Krishna is like the embodiment of the rasa of amor for the gopis. Or, the compound can be understood to refer to Sri Krishna as he whose rasa, that is object of relish, is the love of the gopis. Delighting in the forest of Vrinda can also be interpreted to mean he whose longing or great desire is for Vrindavan, that is the secluded forest where we can engage freely, where he, meaning Krishna, can engage freely in Leela with the gopis. So as Gyanis are fond of, living out in some pristine natural environment to do their meditation, we also are very fond of a natural setting, but not quite that one. Rather, we're very fond of that forest of Vrindavan where Krishna is engaged in his Leela. So now, I have a point here from Jiva Goswami's Bhakti Sandarbha, where he explains with reference to the definition of a mahanta given by Rishabdev in the Bhagavatam, that mahantas or mahatmas or mahats, all of terms are synonymous, are of two types. One follows the path of Gyan and has realization of Brahman. One follows the path of Bhakti and has realization of Bhagavan. We just discussed this same passage recently in our classes on Chaitanya Charitamrita, so I'm not going to go into it again. It came up just in a recent class when this verse of Rishabdev came in the Madhya 22. So it's just the same passage, so I think those who heard that class are already familiar with it, so I'll just leave it at this for today. But I just cite this here to indicate that as per Jiva Goswami's analysis and in general among our Goswamis, there isn't a condemnation or an invalidation of the path of Gyan. There's respect for it, and there's respect for those who follow it. So there's confident conviction and adherence to the path of Bhakti, coupled with respect and acknowledgement of the validity, the scriptural support of the path of Gyan, as well as the admirability of the qualities and the mahats that take up that path, which is by no means an easy path, and exhibit great perseverance and many other admirable qualities in the pursuit of success on that path. So from this verse, as I'm seeing it and taking it, there's a nice model for how one can have conviction by virtue of the value that one personally, subjectively perceives in the path that one follows, not necessarily in an assumed objective standard that everyone ought to accept, and that because I assume there's some objective standard that everyone ought to accept, I self-justify myself taking an argumentative or an aggressive or coercive stance towards others who are of another persuasion or of another emphasis. Rather, the justification for the adherence of the path of bhakti is simply its aesthetic value, simply that here, I prefer that blue luster shines in my head, in my heart, not the white light. I like blue and not white. In other words, fundamentally, it's, there after so much analysis of Shastra, after so much discussion of philosophy, ultimately things come down to aesthetics. They come down to what an individual, based on their own past association, the samskar that they have, what they can really feel conviction in and what they can sincerely follow, according to the psychological makeup and orientation that they have. And that the path taught by the Shastras, the path taught by the Bhagavatam, is not meant to force people to go against the way that their psyche is attuned. Rather, it's there to facilitate that. So, to respect, how things may be, and how, there's a place for all of these things in the Shastra as well as in the infinite reality that Bhagavan himself is the author of, if you will, and to honor that, there's diversity is appreciable, diversity is to be respected, and to not waste time on unnecessary arguments or personal. If one has a personal sense of inferiority or uncertainty due to others not seeing one's own path to be as great as oneself perceives it, then just keep following your path and prove to yourself that it's really of value. Don't, try to prop up your ego by convincing someone else of it and, taking time away from yourself actually, succeeding in proving true the convictions and the aspirations that you've taken to. So anyway, a few general words perhaps on some social impact that this type of expression of Ishvara Puripad can be seen to have. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, they're welcome to share.
Maharaj, you gave a verse at the beginning of the class about how Krishna enjoys the bhav.
Yeah.
Can you quote that verse again, or that little section?
The famous phrase is bhava-grahi janardana.
Okay.
And it's found in the Chaitanya Bhagavat, and it's a pre-existent statement that's quoted in the Chaitanya Bhagavat.
Okay. And then who are the main commentators that you're translating?
The commentator on the Padyavali, his name is Birachandra Goswami.
Okay.
In the first class that I did in this series, I gave an explanation of his commentary and his life history and everything like that. So for more information, you could check out the introduction to this course.
Okay, I will. Now, what I'm getting from the last few classes is that it's not enough for us to just do our seva, but we really have to work on refining our self-concept of not only negating our current attachments, but cultivating a positive abhiman towards Krishna, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Well, we can conclude here for the evening. And if we're so blessed, then next week, by the grace of Srimad Mahaprabhu, Sri Rupa Goswami Pad, we'll go further into these relishable expressions of Bhaktas' Niṣṭhā. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.
Radhe.
Shyam.